Good afternoon and welcome to this session at the Nordic Pavilion where we will discuss short-lived climate forcers and more particularly first methane and the Global Methane Pledge, but then we will also be in broader discussions about short-lived climate forcers, both in the Arctic but also globally. As some of the findings of today's event comes from a Nordic Council of Ministers funded project called REDUCE. So I would like to thank the organizers from the Nordic Pavilion, which is an excellent platform for AMAP and other organizations to reach out with our knowledge, which is of relevance for Nordic countries and also the rest of the world. So I would like to thank in particular Clean Air Coalition, Climate and Clean Air Coalition and Clean Air Fund for valuable contributions to AMAP's work on short-lived climate forces, and happy to have one of the representatives from CAF here today. The program today has been a little bit changed because there is no screen here, so we had to reschedule some of the talks. But first we will summarize a presentation from Lena Höglund Isaksson from YASA. She has been analyzing the NDCs and how that reflects the status of the Global Methane Pledge. And after that, we will have a discussion here on stage with two of our experts on short-lived climate forcers. So instead of the recorded video, I will have my colleague Gosha Smisek-Rice summarizing the findings from that presentation. So, Gosha, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, as said, it is not exactly as planned, but we really wanted to share this update. So, I'm actually going to read it out the way Lena prepared this presentation. So, the Global Methane Pledge, as everybody probably in the room here knows, was launched at the COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. And the target is to reduce global methane emissions from human activities by at least 40% between 2020 and 2030 to be in line with the Paris Agreement. At halftime to the target year, an analysis of the progress of the Global Methane Pledge will take place at this very COP here in Belém. The target to reduce 40% in 2030 corresponds to about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees reduced warming, and it is one of the few remaining options we still have to limit global warming in the next few decades. So by June 2025, there were 160 parties, mostly countries, that have signed up to jointly limit methane emissions by 30% between 2020 and 2030. They account for about 55% of global anthropogenic emissions of methane. And in addition, major non-signatory countries like China and India have presented own plans for methane mitigation in their methane mitigation roadmaps and action plans. The detailed plans for the methane mitigation measures have been presented by countries in their national determined contributions NDCs, which have been submitted to the UNFCCC. And for this analysis, we have used the NDCs that were submitted as of end of June 2025. This analysis is part of input to the UNEP Global Methane Status Report, which will be launched next Monday on the 17th of November at COP30 here in Belém. But here you will get a sneak peek of some of the results. The quantitative analysis was performed using YASA GAINS model, which estimates total anthropogenic methane emissions standing at 352 megatons in 2020. Reduction by 40% in 2030 would mean reducing emissions to 246 megaton in that year. A business-as-usual scenario without further legislation that currently implemented, emissions are expected to increase by 5% to 2030, which is somewhat slower than what was expected at the time of adoption of the GMP in 2021, when a 9% increase was expected in 2030. Assuming that all measures mentioned in the NDCs and action plans would be fully implemented as a result of effective regulatory incentives, we find that the planned measures could bring a net emission reduction of up to 8% between 2020 and 2030. Still far from meeting the 30% target, but nonetheless, if materialized, it would represent the largest sustained reduction in anthropogenic methane emissions since the start of recorded emissions in the 19th century. If you find this result a little daunting, the good news is that with full implementation of existing methane mitigation technology, model results show it would be possible to get to actually 32% reduction by 2030. So to sum up, at halftime of the Global Methane Pledge, we see some limited progress, but by far not enough to halt an increasing trend in anthropogenic methane emissions. With full implementation measures in NDCs and roadmaps as of June 2025, it would be possible with up to 8% reduction in emissions to 2030 compared to 2020. For more details of this analysis, in particular at the sector level, please check out the launch of the UNEP Global Methane Status Report on Monday, the 17th November at COP here in Belém. Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe I forgot to introduce myself. So I will do that first. So I'm Maria Kvalevåg. I'm a Deputy Secretary at the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, which is a pan-Arctic organization with the 8 Arctic member states and 6 permanent participants representing indigenous peoples in the Arctic. And we have the mandate to monitor and assess the state and trends of the Arctic related to climate and pollution. And one of our expert groups, have 7 different expert groups, and one of them are on short-lived climate forcers, dedicated specifically targeted black carbon and methane. So that's why we have this special session here today. But then I would like to spend the rest of this session talking to my 2 experts here in the room. And may you please have a seat and I will introduce you. So this is Kaarle Kupiainen from the Finnish Environment Government. And this is Tom Grylls from the Clean Air Fund. And my first question will go to you, Kaarle, if the microphone is working. You are a climate negotiator for the Finnish delegation, but also one of the leaders of AMAP's expert group on short-lived climate forces. So you have a good scientific and policy understanding of the topic of short-lived climate forces. So my first question goes to you, if we can address this Global Methane Pledge first. What is the status of this pledge in the negotiations and what are the next steps? There will be like an assistant coming.
Test.
Okay. Thank you for the question and great to be here. I'm indeed from the Environment Ministry of Finland. Happy to be here and have a long track record so already in Arctic cooperation and particularly AMAP, where I started in 2009 in the short-lived climate forcer process, which was very young at that time. And indeed it has led to I think 3 full assessments and now very interesting topical highlights that you also mentioned. On the GMP, as we all know, the Global Methane Pledge is not a negotiated item. It was an initiative of first the European Commission and the United States prior to Glasgow's COP meeting, and eventually it rallied almost 100 countries before the Glasgow negotiations, and as such already demonstrated the momentum that was behind methane action and the importance of methane. And those of who remember the cover decision from Glasgow, which was first after the COVID break, so there was a break of a couple of years, it already highlighted methane as an important area for governments to work on. So therefore, even though it is not a negotiated item, the initiatives and particularly Global Methane Pledge in this case can play an important catalyzing role in terms of issues be reflected in the negotiated outcomes. And it was not only Glasgow that's where we ended. I mean, Sharm el-Sheikh, our decision took basically the mitigation section from the Glasgow as it stood. So again, an enforcement on methane. And I would say that the highlight, even almost for the first half of this decade, is the decision that was taken in Dubai on global stocktake. That was the main outcome from Dubai. And it also calls particularly methane as part of the mitigation portfolio that needs to be touched upon. So this is how the Global Methane Pledge plays an important catalyzing role in the negotiations, even though it is not as such a negotiated outcome. And to finalize about the future, the question is, of course, very good. What role can it play? I mean, it can play a role that continue to provide the momentum and bring in more countries under its umbrella, let's say. It can also bring in new information about sectoral policies, sectoral actions across the globe, and also in cooperation with Climate and Clear Action, which is the implementing body of that specific pledge. But why not AMAP and Nordic Council of Ministers? I think we both, AMAP and Nordic Council of Ministers, have worked on methane. So we need that area for sure. And this will eventually first feed into the NDCs. We heard an analysis by Lena and others from YASA looking at the NDCs from the methane perspective. It has been done before, but now it's time to do it again for the 2035 NDCs, how these are reflected. And eventually next year we will launch at this time the second global stocktake with all the phases that will follow. And it's important that we have still the methane pledge bringing in the voice of methane and others into whatever then is the negotiated item from there. And let us see, of course, what comes from here, from Belém first, and see if there's space for methane there. I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah. I can follow up on this cooperation, since we are at the Nordic Pavilion, that what role the Nordic countries in particular can play on methane and methane mitigation. Do you have any comments on that? And also maybe broader the Arctic community, since it is a greenhouse gas that also has global impact.
Well, in the Nordic context, we have looked into it. We have compiled Nordic solutions, Nordic measures across the sectors. It's some years back that we did that kind of mapping, that it's been, of course, sort of in the portfolio all through. We have also supported the Arctic Council's assessments and AMAP assessments from the Nordic Council side, particularly emphasizing the networking part of that process, because it's a big process. It brings in, eventually in the writing phase, 100 scientists to work on the same issue. So it is, and everyone sort of comes, like in the IPCC, they come with their own voluntary contribution, but certain issues needs to be supported. So that's what we have channeled through Nordic Council of Ministers. So not only substance, but also support the processes.
Yeah. Thank you. I then move over to Tom Grylls. You are the head of super pollutants at the Clear Air Fund, where you lead a team and program of work to accelerate action on short-lived climate forces. Can you tell us a little bit about CAF and how you are working on improving the scientific understanding of short-lived climate forces?
For sure, thank you. So yeah, basically an overview of the Clean Air Fund. Overview of the Clean Air Fund is that we're a global philanthropic organization that was set up in 2019 because there was a gap in philanthropic flows specifically to the problem of air pollution. And the role of the organization is to fundraise for the field, bring in more philanthropies on air pollution at the intersection of climate and health, and also to make the case for development funders and finance to bring more funding to this issue. So over the last 6 years, we've fundraised and re-granted about $200 million all over the world on the topic of air pollution. And as I said, the kind of core vision of the organization is about clean air. But in our theory of change, we're very clear about wanting to do that in a way that has benefits for both climate and health. And inevitably, as our strategies, our theory of change has evolved, that's taken us to think a lot about the short-lived climate pollutants, which have a gross warming effect, but are also influencing air pollution. So specific focus around black carbon, tropospheric ozone and its precursors, including methane. So in 2023, we kickstarted our super pollutants program. So this is one of our global portfolios within the Clean Air Fund. And the concept there is to understand to what extent, alongside our work on air pollution globally, can we elevate the unique climate forcing, for example, of black carbon and that intersectionality between climate change and air pollution. And with the funding we have to date, we've kind of split this down into 5 work streams. So one on the science, which I'll talk about a little bit more. One around communications and field building, for those interested, be that NGOs, the research community, governments. One on policy and advocacy, so supporting different NGOs, think tanks, campaigners engaging on these issues in different places. One on finance, so again, speaking to development banks, thinking to bilateral development agencies on funding flows towards this. And then finally on the solution. So when you have a specific pollutant that you're thinking, obviously it's co-emitted with many others, but where does it take you? In the same way that for methane, that takes you to the waste sector, to agriculture, to oil and gas. What does that look like for black carbon, in addition to existing decarbonization and existing action on air pollution? So to go through a little bit more on the science strategy, we are kind of trying to be driven as much as possible by the goals we have on the policy and advocacy side of the work. So what are the key questions that governments, finance institutions are asking and need to be answered to see the increased level of ambition that we would like to see in cutting black carbon emissions? And that takes us to different regional frameworks, such as the Arctic Council, the Gothenburg Protocol, but also to global frameworks such as the NDC process, the biennial transparency reports, the WHO guidelines. So a big part of that is about reducing uncertainties. I think one of the challenges for these very short-lived climate forces in global space and in forums like COP is that their effects don't quite work in the same way as well-mixed greenhouse gases. They can have very localized, very regional effects, and often the uncertainty bar that you see in reports like important reports like AR6 is that bit larger for species like black carbon as opposed to CO2. So a lot of work on the uncertainties that I'll get into, and then other focus areas of providing more evidence on the relative toxicity of black carbon as compared to PM2.5 more generally, to help inform to what extent should we be prioritizing this from a health perspective, or should we stick with PM2.5? Thinking about metrics. So I think at the intersection of climate change and air pollution, one of the challenges with bringing those two fields together is the typical climate metrics are built around greenhouse gases and often long-term warming. And for air pollution, we're often talking about PM2.5. And those metrics make it a little bit harder to bring the two topics together. So we have a project with Duke University and IIT Bombay looking at how we can develop metrics that are more regionally and locally specific. So thinking about in South Asia, how black carbon and co-pollutants aren't just affecting health, are also affecting rate change, also affecting extreme heat, and how we can bring that together into like economic metrics. And then more regional scale evidence as well. So thinking in the Arctic with AMAP around modeling policy pathways, and across other regions looking at how short-lived climate pollutant actions don't just affect net warming on the global scale or local public health, but also regional changes in rainfall, extreme heat, etc. On uncertainty, I think one of the key things that we've learned in our work on black carbon is the gap between observations and modeling in different parts of the world, and particularly in South Asia. So we're working with the Spartan Network, which is a global network doing PM2.5 speciation, and also with climate observatories in the Maldives and Bangladesh. And really important for this question of certainty on results and what policy recommendations can be made is that there's a big discrepancy between modeled and observation. And in the AR6 report, a lot of the forcing of black carbon was focused on the modeling side. So we have grants with Stockholm University, with Helsinki University, focus on very specific parts of what paints the picture of how important or not black carbon is. So around its mass absorption coefficient in the atmosphere, around revising emissions inventories based on observations, around looking at different kind of biomass to fossil fuel ratios, and then also around how it is transported into cryosphere regions such as the Himalayas. So yeah, many different science pieces that we're interested on black carbon. And at the moment, the other thing we're thinking about is tropospheric ozone too, from a short-lived climate forcer perspective, and what philanthropy can do to help policymakers and others understand ozone response when we're also thinking about how emissions are changing. How can we understand ozone response at different spatial scales? And that's something else that we're also thinking about.
Thank you. It's a huge portfolio that you have, and it's very important. But what is the specific role of the philanthropy part of this to accelerate action? Because I feel there are more philanthropies now, and I think that's important to actually do this acceleration on action. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think if philanthropy is done well, the idea would be that the funding can move a little bit faster than other types of funding. We can take a little bit more risk than other types of funding. And if done really well, it should be catalytic. So we should be supporting things that grow and are able to scale through other types of financing flows. So for me, those are like the three things to consider when we're developing our strategies. And part of that is because the total amount of funding is relatively smaller than some domestic government spend or development finance flows. I think in the last year in particular, we're seeing that actually that balance is beginning to change. Like as development finance in some areas is going down, there's an increasing need for philanthropy to step in. A few considerations we take on the science side as Clean Air Fund is the disadvantages of philanthropy is sometimes like the sustainability of funding. So for things like long-term monitoring of pollution, ideally, philanthropy is a bit of an unreliable source. Like we don't want to be supporting reference grade monitors all over the world, and then in 4 years' time, our funding cycle changes, and we're not able in a position to keep those things going. So how we think about it is, with the scale of funding we have, what are the interventions that we can take? So a little bit back to what I said before, as opposed to being able to develop new emissions factors in underserved parts of the world, we're looking at very specific parts of the picture, bringing together the emissions inventory people and the modeling people and the observation people, and trying to play that kind of field building role, just because we don't have the scale of funding to develop emissions factors everywhere. And similar for monitoring, we can't support that, but how is the data that is available being used? How is it being managed? How is it being visualized so it's actually usable? So those kind of more downstream effects. Overall, when we're thinking about methane and other short-lived climate pollutants, so for methane reduction projects, as of last year, the total mobilized grant funding was about 2 billion. And to Lena's point of this kind of implementation gap, the amount that's forecast to be needed is 48 billion. So there's a huge gap, and philanthropy has a role to play, but so do development finance institutions and others. And then for black carbon, so each year we track philanthropic and development finance flows to air pollution. And as part of that, we look at the specific projects that mention black carbon, which is not that many of them. And from 2022 to 2023, there was just $8 million of development finance that specifically was on black carbon, soot, or that area of the short-lived climate pollutant world, and that went down to just 1 million in 2023. So I think for finance institutions, philanthropy, development finance, what we need to be working with funders is how do we get the balance right of the importance of looking at this other half of global warming and these regional impacts, and where does that meet the action on the ground within the transport sector or in forest fire management or in gas flare? So the Global Methane Pledge is a great example where the pledge was around a short-lived climate forcer. It drew attention to the waste sector, to oil and gas, to agriculture. And how do we scale that up in other areas? What does that look like for black carbon? Those are the kind of things we're working on.
Thank you. Can I borrow the policy brief that you have? Because I wanted to move to the science to policy and how to communicate uncertainties and such. So I would like to say that AMAP recently, we have now launched a preprint of a new policy brief on black carbon as a climate forcer, where we explain the different scientific findings around the radiative forcing of black carbon and how it has changed from earlier, from the AR5 to the AR6, and the understanding of all the different mechanisms of how black carbon is contributing to climate change. So this is a new way actually that AMAP would like to communicate uncertainties, making shorter briefs with specific topics that is relevant for policies. And I would like to hear if you have any recommendations of why it's how we can communicate better with these uncertainties, and especially in places like COP. So Kaarle first.
Okay, yes, thank you. Well, uncertainties are there, but uncertainties shouldn't prohibit action when there's enough information. And when I started to work on black carbon in 2001, we were ourselves very worried about the uncertainties. I was working actually with at YASA at that time, together eventually with Lena. She wasn't yet there, but joined us very shortly. So, but then when we were refining, getting new information, getting rid of you never get rid of uncertainty, but nevertheless reducing the uncertainty side, actually the main sectors, the main messages remained. So one has to be a bit careful with indeed how to communicate uncertainty, because it can also, kill action or lead to less action. And I think this is a little bit what we see in the black carbon side. There was the boost, also the high policy boost, not least in Europe, but also from the North America on this issue 10 years ago, approximately. And now there was the AR6, which highlighted certain uncertainties and new parameterization, indicating it was globally not such a important forcer yet. I tend to read it differently because you still see the bar if you look at the radiative forcing since prehistoric times. But there are so many ways to read these reports, and I don't think the scientists really meant that it should channel away funding, for example, from black carbon side, because we have analyzed it a lot from Finnish side, because our leadership has been engaging a lot on that topic as well. And actually the measures that target black carbon or black carbon rich sources, they are the ones that are extremely rich in PM2.5. So it's a no-brainer to work on these sources, and it's only good to understand also the climate side and the implications of that. And we are in the north, we are close to the cryosphere, and I wouldn't go to it, but I say it anyways. So of course, the earlier method to get rid of ice from your porch was to spread out some dark material, absorbing material, soot even, onto the porch. So we know that it matters on snow and ice and reflective. So I think it's, as you rightly point out, it's a very careful thread how to communicate uncertainties, and what should always bear in mind that what consequences does it have for action and eventually the impacts of the actions, of course.
Do you want to add, Tom?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think I agree. I think there's enough evidence out there that we know we need to act, especially from the health perspective and also from the climate perspective. I think there's a job to be done where, going away slightly from the science side and just the narrative and inspiring people to take action side on how we're talking about it. I think the framing of black carbon at the intersection of climate change and air pollution is powerful. It's this visceral thing that you can see coming out of the back of a diesel truck. You can do experiments like in Bogota, putting a sheet on the side of the road, and then over the course of a day, seeing how this gets darker and imagining how that's impacting your lungs as well as what's going on in the atmosphere. It also, in many places, is so related to poverty and social justice. If we're taking a lens of emission reduction from black carbon, we're often having to deal with these kind of structural issues, which is also what development funding to be going to, whether that's waste burning practices or the reliance on dirty or polluting fuels inside people's homes. And then, yeah, the two other things in terms of that messaging that I would say is the cryosphere link is such a clear one and where the evidence is strongest. In the Arctic, I think there's a really powerful movement behind that, including with AMAP and others. But there's other cryosphere regions where that's also relevant in the Himalayas. How are we thinking about that? There's a World Bank report specifically on the Himalayas that has started to talk about black carbon, but where does that fit in the regional process and different countries' NDCs? Black carbon is now in Nepal's NDC, for example. So that cryosphere link, I think as evidence grows on other regional impacts like monsoon change and extreme heat, maybe for other parts of the world, that will become another important part of emission reduction planning. And then secondly, on this whole world of action on air pollution, be that international frameworks like the Gothenburg Protocol or national level policies, city level, if it's a no-brainer, as you said, like we need to cut PM 2.5. Air pollution is a huge health and economic risk factor for all countries worldwide. If we're thinking about the black carbon component of that, we're in some way maximizing the climate benefit. So it's not that, sometimes climate and air pollution are so siloed that the conversation is like, oh, in AR6, the reduction was this much, so we'll leave it. But that's ignoring the fact that there's this whole ecosystem wanting to improve people's health, make local communities cleaner, clean up the streets, have green spaces on air pollution. And black carbon should be a key component of that and a great tactic to get that air pollution community to align more closely with climate. So in Mexico, in Chile, in Colombia, where black carbon has been in the NDC for a few years now, it's been a really important component of the governments working together between climate change and air pollution teams and doing policy planning that's holistic across health, air pollution, the economic benefits of that, and climate. So yeah, I think there's lots of strong narratives, and what's interesting, and I'm keen to hear at COP and everyone's ideas, is like, how do we bring this together into something really cohesive that fits into this growing super pollutants movement, fits into what's happening on methane, and can bring different sectoral actions and bring more finance to those.
Yeah.
Thanks. Just to add, since you highlighted the AMAP's products, and of course I'm a bit biased since I'm a bit part of the planning, but I think this is the idea of having more agile, more focused, and to the point products. Maybe one could say that maybe in between the larger assessments, it might be that at some point of time we need a larger assessment to have the strong backbone of science to what we say. But in the meanwhile, and these are of course the same scientific teams that are compiling these, so it's not a different set of people. So maybe with this it helps it to communicate. Also when it comes to the uncertainty, so just support.
Yeah, I just wanted also to just ask now that IPCC is starting its next cycle, and you have the methodology report on short-lived climate forces. Do you think there will be a different way of communicating the forcing in the AR7, or have there been any reflections about, since it's
Well, I think it's the modeling community that has to look into what is their parameterization, and we have to, from the policy side, listen to what they say. So that's for sure. But I mean, and the methodology report is accounting rules for those pollutants. So we'll see. But I think it brings a level global playing field on reporting, because we've been lacking here and there inventories and information about black carbon emissions. So hopefully when it's eventually embedded into the inventories, it is then possible and more easy to access global information on short-lived climate forces. Well, of course, on a national level, but nevertheless from, let's say, all countries in the world in a hypothetical future case.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Hello? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this extremely interesting panel. I guess I have 2 or maybe 3 questions. And one of them is, part of the presentation that we've heard from Lena is that actually much greater reductions are possible with already technologies that we have at hand. And I think there's been a big momentum behind the Global Methane Pledge. Discussions about super pollutants are definitely getting more and more attention, and yet we are like at this half point. But until 2030 we haven't seen the deployment of these technologies at scale that perhaps we should have. So I wanted to ask first your reflection on this. On the second point, it's a question of monitoring. It's the importance of monitoring of those emissions, because I think there was, especially for methane, with methane sat, with the satellite, there was, again, it was getting a lot of attention until it went quiet. But the point was, what is your reflection on the importance of monitoring, also for the accountability of those efforts and commitments, but also where do we see at this point gaps in monitoring, perhaps both of methane and black carbon? Thank you.
You want to start? Okay. Well, thank you. The first one was why there are measures, why don't they happen then? And this is something that we've been discussing. And I remember it was maybe in the CCAC setting that one of our, or GMI, Global Methane Initiative or somewhere, one of our colleagues from Africa said that, you know, when you have big revenues in certain sectors, something that would pay back in a couple of years, but are still a small issue, doesn't happen necessarily. So it's not that even some of these, like Yasa puts on paper, that some of these measures should pay back in a relatively extremely short time. So again, a no-brainer, I guess. But if it's sort of a minor thing in the total revenue flow, it might not still happen. So there are these kind of interesting, strange barriers to that action. And of course, in some cases, you might have it as a theoretical, already proven technology there, but it simply costs too much per, CO2 ton reduced compared to those which are maybe targeting more traditional greenhouse gases, like you pointed out. And this is a little bit of a metric issue, I guess, again. But I see that happening to some extent, not always, but to some extent in our national policy making as well. So we look at the cost of things, cost of measures, and sometimes some measures that are, if you only have a pollutant level or gas specific focus, they are simply so much costlier than if you have a multi-gas focus. Now, of course, with the metrics that we use. But anyways, yeah. So I don't know if that's a sort of question, but at least some elaboration of the challenge we have. And there we need the pledges and the initiatives to start pushing, showing lessons learned. We need work like World Bank is doing on oil and gas to show the benefits and build the regulatory, or help out to build the regulatory work and all that. So the full set of everything we have on climate and other policy planning. And the other monitoring. Oh yeah. Well, that's of course a crucial key cornerstone, I would say, of all these things that we do. Inventories can be considered one monitoring element, but we all know that they are not always telling us exactly what's happening on ground. And for that we need on-site monitoring, we need the satellites and of course the ground stations as well, just to name something from the top of the head. And we have actually monitoring experts here in the audience as well, so happy to hear also from the audience if you want to chip in. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd add on the gaps, I guess, specifically on methane. I think another element is some of these things, it's been a relatively short space of time, and initially they were pilot projects. So I think on the methane side, in the waste sector, we're learning together as a community on what is and isn't working. I think that is partly tying into where there's a gap between the commitments and the emission reductions so far. The other obvious one that I already mentioned is the finance gap. I think there's it's quantified there, 2 billion versus 48 billion. If we want to see the maximum technically feasible reduction from the countries that have signed up to that, there's going to be a need for more finance incentives. And, back to my other point, I think an important element of that is how we're quantifying the cost versus benefit analysis. And for methane, if we're looking at how that also is affecting air pollution, the economic benefits of it become much stronger. And I think there's one stat from the Lancet that made its way into the last IPCC report of the economic benefits associated with like cleaner air from delivering on the Paris Agreement would outweigh the policy costs. So it depends how you count it a little bit, but that shows like it's the same order of magnitude that you could get as an economic benefit from less people missing work, from premature deaths, from higher healthcare costs, as some of the policy costs associated with implementation. And the other point on methane, I think, is there's some big emitters that aren't part of the Global Methane Pledge. There are other countries developing action plans on methane. And I think for that as well, there's a benefit to thinking about the climate impact of this, but also the other co-benefits as drivers. For example, in India, where air quality is a huge political national level issue, highlighting the link between methane and ozone and the problems that cities in India are having with air pollution is another way to help with methane. So back to my main point of bringing those two things together. And then for reporting, overall agreed is obviously fundamental. I think through the biennial transparency reports, good practice would be to report on all of the air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that you're tracking, as opposed to just greenhouse gases. And I think that helps when we're thinking about some of these other short-lived climate forces. And then from the philanthropic side, also having like non-governmental checks on these processes. So we have a grant with an organization called Climate Trace that works with lots of other different think tanks and NGOs and is using satellite data to create, to estimate emissions from different point sources and sectors all over the world. And they've expanded that now, not just from greenhouse gases to air pollutants. I think where that kind of challenge comes from remote sensing and non-governmental reporting and intergovernment reporting, perhaps is another useful driver for maximizing transparency and regular update on emissions.
Thank you so much. And our time is up, actually. I'm so happy we had some extra time, actually, to talk and discuss this today. So by this, I will thank you all for being here and thank to Kaarle and Thomas in particular.
Thank you.